Today's episode of Voiced is from r/petty revenge and is about a savvy employee who turns the tables on a potential job cut and a vengeful student who orchestrates the ultimate downfall of a high school teacher. What crafty methods did they use to get their sweet revenge? Subscribe if you enjoy.
About 5 years ago, my company brought in an individual to see if my position was no longer needed. I passed with flying colors. Not to give too much information away, I was hired at an organization with a job title of basically helper. Well, for someone who is supposed to just be helping, I had a ridiculous amount of work. Almost all of my coworkers were huge technologically illiterate baby boomers. So I actually sort of thrived as a very useful person. For example, one guy would spend half his day copying items and passing them into another program we use. He didn't even use Control-C, Control-V. He would right-click, then copy, then go into the Files menu or something and insert copied item from clipboard. He was so proud of himself when he showed me because, don't worry, you won't have to retype everything. I wrote a program to do this automatically, but did not tell him. So I would just run it occasionally as part of my responsibilities. Anyway, I did a lot of stuff like this. I'd estimate I saved about 15 hours of work every day on top of the 8.5 hours I did too. But then insert Sergeant face. This wasn't the military, but I just like to call him that. We are having a team meeting when he shows up. White hair combed okayish, a scrunched face, glasses. He just sort of showed up one day and took notes during our morning meeting. At one point, someone brought up the name of one of our customers. I said, "Oh, is that the 300-pound guy with a big beard?" Sort of as a joke, because I mostly do back-end stuff. There was a guy like this I recently did some entrance work for. But I was wrong. And my boss said, "No, it's blah blah some other person." Okay. Then we talked about that person a bit. Fast forward about a week, and this sergeant is a complete jerk to me. I don't know why. He will ignore me during group conversations and literally sometimes scoff at me. Who actually scoffs at people? I was having a really rough week looking for some extremely important files. People were yelling all day. I was exasperated. Too much to do. I was having anxiety attacks at home in the middle of the night. But it was Friday, so I was pulling through. As I looked for this file, I ended up deep on our file structure, and the search returned a personal folder structure within one of the drives. I clicked out of curiosity, and there it was, FF's notes. I opened it, and there was a whole section about me. This guy basically goes from location to location, getting people fired to save the chief executive officer's money, and he was working on me now. I scrolled through his notes, and at the very top I saw Frosty thought a 4'10", 24-year-old female patient was a 300-pound bearded man. Clearly atrocious attention to detail. That's just one example of how completely messed up his comments were. So in combination with my job, which I generally liked and enjoyed helping people, knowing I wasn't getting paid enough for my effort, this horrible week I had, and Sergeant face comments, I said, forget this. I set up 3 email configurations, one to my boss, letting him know I will be taking 2 weeks of vacation time, to be sent at 10 p.m. tonight. To the company, letting them know I will not be present for 2 weeks. So whatever work they currently need me to do, they will need to do themselves. To be sent Monday morning at 4 a.m. 3, for any emails that came in, I set an auto response that said, I will be out for an unknown amount of time. For any routine, emergency, or even occasional items, it is imperative you reach out to Sergeant Face at XXXXX for assistance. Then I turned off every automated task I had ever set up. Then I swung by his temporary office and said, I think I found a way to make your job easier. He didn't even really turn his head to look at me, but just raised one eyebrow. Then I left. I actually got multiple calls on Monday morning. I didn't answer. It didn't last long, apparently. But I stayed strong and didn't respond to anything. On Wednesday, I had a little anxiety about it, but I stayed as strong as I could. I thought about the tasks that needed a 2-day turnaround. There's no way some of the guys were keeping up with their normal duties. Guaranteed at least 2 people were no longer doing their normal jobs just to keep up with my automated tasks. I got a long email to my personal account, I guess from my resume or when I interviewed, from my boss on Thursday night of the first week. It went something like this. Frosty, I know you're a smart person and probably figured out what the company had us doing. I would say it's very important you call me, but that probably isn't going to work, I see. I've talked with Sergeant Forgetful Face's boss, and he will be leaving our location. I explained our progress meetings seemed to be going in the wrong direction and that you are one of our most valuable employees here. I am sure you are probably looking at other jobs at this point, or maybe you have even started one. I hope not. If you could please reach back to me, I would like to offer you a raise. It has become very apparent how useful you are around here. I hear about it every day, believe me. So I came back on Monday with a $10,000 raise and Sergeant Foulmouth out of my face. My boss apologized again in person and said he didn't get a say in it. I think it's a little weird he could have a say after I left, but not before. But I sort of get it. Hopefully this is a better edit than most r/award speech dits. Please just try to bicycle or walk to work once a week or skip one meat-based meal every so often. Try out composting or swap your dairy milk with almond, oat, coconut, or other plant-based milk. If everyone starts to live more sustainably, the markets must switch and follow us, the people, the workers. That's how we get more bicycle lanes and a more sustainable earth where our friends and family can prosper.
Wow, what a ride. From navigating the professional pressures of a toxic workplace to gaining the upper hand over someone trying to undermine your value, this story really highlights the lengths one can go when pushed to the limit. It's impressive how our protagonist transformed a challenging situation into a power move, turning the tables and emerging victorious. Now, speaking of turning the tables, let's shift gears to a different setting: high school. Get ready for a tale of academic rivalry and the ultimate act of vindication, as a student takes on a notorious teacher with unexpected consequences. Buckle up for some serious payback.
The time I ruined my high school teacher's career and got her fired in the greatest way possible. This story is widely known amongst my family and is constantly brought up and joked upon in my group of friends even years later. A buddy of mine suggested that this is the perfect place to make it public. So let's get into this situation. Backstory: I was a senior in high school at the time, and I had never been the brightest student. I was a solid C student, and I had never received a detention or had any kind of bad student record. This is important because, to this day, I still have no idea why the teacher treated me this way. The teacher, who we will name Mrs. Frank, had been a teacher there for more than a decade and was widely known for being a petty, heartless person who the administrators saw as the golden child. Mrs. Frank taught algebra, which is my worst subject, so naturally I had issues understanding the lessons and would ask questions frequently. To some, these questions are easily answered, but to me, it was rocket science. Usually when someone asks a silly question, no one should address it. However, in Mrs. Frank's case, she would belittle me in front of everyone by saying things such as, "And here comes the slow boy again. Wow, surprise, surprise, you don't understand it again. Really? We have to go extra slow for you today, don't we?" etc. I tried going to the administration about it before, but again, she was considered the golden child. They would send someone in to examine her during class. She would act respectful and normal for one day and go back to being unkind the next. This goes on for about half the year, until I had enough. I went to the local Radio Shack, bought a recorder, and secretly recorded every insult she would throw at me. I would sometimes instigate to make up for the lost time. Go ahead, feed the fire. Fast forward to the end of the year, and I'm sitting in Mrs. Frank's class when I ask a question. Her response, and I quote, because it's burned into my brain, was, "I've been teaching here for over 10 years. And that was the single dumbest question I've ever heard come from anyone's mouth." She continued the lesson without answering. I calmly stood up, packed up my stuff, and headed to the nurse's office to dismiss myself from school. We were allowed to dismiss ourselves if we were 18. I went home, compiled all of the brutal tapes into one glorious masterpiece, and headed back the next day to show the administrators. I sat down with the principal, and we listened to a couple of the insults before he stopped me. He wanted more witnesses present, as well as Mrs. Frank. He told me we would meet the next day, where I could show him and the rest of the administrators the full tape. I walk into school the next morning being the most nervous I have ever been for anything. I was called down to the office where I met with some board directors, the local school police officer, the principal, the vice principal, and Mrs. Frank. What follows was some of the greatest minutes of my life. I watched as the administrators went from fed up with being in another useless meeting to furious and speechless, with some of them keeping their mouths open for the duration of the tape. I also watched Mrs. Frank go from confident and stuck up to her realizing that she had messed up beyond repair. She was publicly embarrassing herself in front of the most important people from the district. The tape ended, and without hesitation, the administrators looked around in astonishment, and the principal turned to me and said, "I think we have heard everything we need to, thank you." And I was quietly dismissed from the room. The final time I saw Mrs. Frank was leaving the room. I looked back and we made eye contact through her tear-filled eyes as I gave the biggest, most evil smile. I returned to class the next week, and Mrs. Frank was nowhere to be found. The story spread quickly throughout the school, and I was seen as a saint. I had successfully gotten her fired and made it almost impossible for Mrs. Frank to return to her teaching career, as well as cut off most of her connections she had with other teachers in the school. I had ruined her financially because no school district in the area would hire this walking piece of trash. If you're reading this, Mrs. Frank, I'd like to take this moment to tell you to go screw yourself. My high school teacher belittled me all year. I secretly recorded her and showed the administrators, which led to her being fired. Yes, this was perfectly legal to do, and my parents and I did our research to make sure we weren't breaking any kind of law. In my state, you can record someone in their place of business without both parties' consent. Edit 2. I believe this post became popular because almost everyone can relate to having a horrible teacher at one point in their life. I'm glad I could give some satisfaction to some of you who have had similar situations. I regret sharing the simplified version because I left out the amount of stress I put my parents through during all of this. Tons of meetings and phone calls would have made the story a lot longer. I do not still have the tapes. It was in the administration's best interest to keep them in case she sued for false termination, and it would have gotten out of hand if the tapes spread and gave a bad reputation to the district. Even if I kept the tapes, this all took place over 15 years ago, and there's no way I would be able to find them. Yes, I took algebra as a senior because, again, I wasn't the greatest student to walk those halls, and throughout all my years of school, I had tutoring. I'm sorry I'm not a genius. I don't remember what question I asked that pushed me over the limit that day. I love reading each and everyone's stories that have had similar teachers and experiences of revenge.
Before I dive into today's posts, please consider subscribing for more incredible stories like these. Wow, talk about a roller coaster of workplace and school drama. The first tale of Frosty's epic showdown with Face showcases the power of standing up for yourself and leveraging your skills to secure the recognition you truly deserve. What a way to turn the tables. Then, we have the high school vendetta, where the recording of a vindictive teacher's insults led to her downfall. Pure genius. What do you think about these revenge stories? Have you ever had a similar experience? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Voiced. If you enjoyed daily, high-quality stories, please like and subscribe to show your support.